Margaret Ellis stood outside the front door of the home she had owned for 43 years, waiting for her own son to let her in. At 76, she had survived harder things than a locked door. She had buried her husband after 48 years of marriage. She had raised 2 children while working full-time as a nurse. She had learned how to fix a leaking faucet, shovel a snow-covered driveway, and sleep alone in a bed built for 2. But on this quiet Tuesday morning, she couldn't step into her own house without someone else's permission. She balanced a small paper bag of groceries against her hip and pressed the doorbell. The familiar chime echoed through the hallway. She waited. The maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the autumn breeze. A pair of sparrows hopped across the porch railing Thomas had built the summer before he retired. Across the street, Mrs. Walker was trimming her roses, completely unaware that Margaret was standing outside her own home like a visitor. 35 seconds passed before the front door finally opened. "There you are," David said with an easy smile. "Sorry, Mom. I was upstairs on a work call." "It's all right," Margaret replied. She smiled because smiling had become easier than explaining the strange feeling growing quietly inside her. David reached for the grocery bag before she had fully stepped across the threshold. "I've got that. It isn't heavy. I know." He laughed softly. "I just don't want you carrying more than you need to." Margaret let go of the bag. 3 days earlier, she would have carried it into the kitchen herself. 3 days earlier, she would have unlocked the front door herself, too. The memory returned so clearly that she could almost feel the cool brass resting in her palm. David had stopped by after church that Sunday. Melissa, his wife, had baked blueberry muffins. Their 12-year-old daughter, Emma, had spent the afternoon helping Grandma rake leaves in the backyard. It had been one of those ordinary family Sundays Margaret treasured. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. Until David noticed her searching through her purse. "What are you looking for?" he had asked. "My keys." She found them a moment later tucked beneath a folded grocery list. David smiled, but his smile carried a hint of concern. "You've been misplacing them a lot lately." Margaret laughed. "I misplaced them for about 10 seconds. "I know." He hesitated. Then he extended his hand. "Mom, why don't I hold on to your keys for a while?" She looked at him. He didn't sound demanding. He sounded worried. "I still drive." "I know." "I still go shopping." "I know." "I've lived in this house longer than you've been alive." "I know that too." His voice remained calm. "I'm not trying to take anything away from you." He paused before adding the sentence Margaret had heard more often over the past year than she cared to count. "I'm just trying to keep you safe." Melissa nodded gently. "It would give all of us some peace of mind." Emma looked between the adults without understanding why everyone had suddenly grown so quiet. Margaret lowered her eyes to the small ring of keys resting in her hand. There wasn't much to it. A brass house key, a mailbox key, and a tiny silver key that no longer opened anything. Thomas had carried that little silver key for years before attaching it to hers. Neither of them remembered what it had originally belonged to. Over time, it simply became part of home. She ran her thumb across its smooth edges one last time. Then she placed the keys into David's open hand. "If that makes you feel better," she said. David wrapped his fingers around them and leaned over to kiss her forehead. "It does." At the time, Margaret believed she had handed her son a set of keys. She didn't realize she had also handed him something far more valuable. Over the next 3 days, small things began changing. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough for Margaret to feel that the rhythm of her own life was becoming slightly unfamiliar. David texted before stopping by instead of knocking. Melissa organized the kitchen cabinets because she thought they would be easier. Emma mentioned that Dad wanted Grandma to take it easy from now on. Each change seemed reasonable. Each one came wrapped in love. Each one required Margaret to give up something so small it hardly seemed worth mentioning. Until this morning, standing on her own front porch, waiting for someone else to unlock her own front door. Margaret wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. What unsettled her most was the quiet question she couldn't seem to shake. If losing the house keys felt this small, why did it feel as though something much bigger had just slipped out of her hands? When people imagine losing their independence, they often picture a single dramatic moment. A doctor's diagnosis, a serious fall, a difficult conversation. For Margaret Ellis, it happened differently. It disappeared, one small decision at a time. A week after David took her house keys, Margaret woke before sunrise, just as she had for decades. She brewed coffee, opened the kitchen curtains, and watched the first light settle across the backyard Thomas had loved so much. For a few peaceful minutes, everything felt normal. Then her phone vibrated. "Morning, Mom. Don't forget I already picked up your prescription yesterday. No need to drive into town today." Margaret looked toward the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. She had written pharmacy, 10, in neat blue ink 3 weeks earlier. She smiled faintly and crossed it out. It wasn't disappointment she felt, it was something harder to name. A plan she had made for herself had quietly become someone else's decision. 2 days later, she decided to bake Helen's favorite apple pie before their monthly bridge club. For nearly 20 years, the same 5 women had gathered on the first Friday of every month. Sometimes they played cards. Sometimes they forgot to. Mostly they laughed. Margaret placed the warm pie on the passenger seat and drove across town. The church fellowship hall was dark. The parking lot was empty. She checked her watch. 10 o'clock. She wasn't early. She called Helen. "Margaret, you aren't at church." A pause. "We thought you weren't coming." "I've never missed bridge." Another silence. Then Helen spoke carefully. "David called everyone yesterday." Margaret's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "What did he say?" "He said you were getting tired more easily and thought it was best if we gave you a break for a while." Margaret closed her eyes. "I never asked him to do that. I know that now." Helen sounded heartbroken. "I'm so sorry." Margaret thanked her, ended the call, and remained sitting in the quiet parking lot. The apple pie was still warm. No one would be there to eat it. For the first time, she wondered how many pieces of her life had been rearranged while everyone believed they were helping. That Sunday, Margaret dressed for church anyway. She pinned on the small silver cross Thomas had given her on their 25th wedding anniversary. Just as she reached for her coat, David walked through the front door carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Perfect timing," he said brightly. "I thought we'd watch the service online today." Margaret frowned. "I was planning to go." "I know." He handed her one of the cups. "But it's cold outside, and the parking lot gets crowded." "I've parked there for 30 years. I'd just feel better if you stayed home." He said it with such kindness that arguing almost felt unreasonable. Almost. Margaret looked toward the front door, then back at her son. Without another word, she hung her coat back inside the closet. David smiled, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." Margaret smiled too, but it wasn't agreement, it was exhaustion. The following week, Emma stopped by after school to work on a history project. The 2 of them sat at the dining room table, surrounded by old family photographs. Emma picked up a picture of Margaret standing beside a bright red station wagon. "Were you really allowed to drive all the way to Florida by yourself?" Margaret laughed. "I wasn't just allowed. I planned the whole trip. Emma's eyes widened. Dad says you don't really like driving anymore. Margaret looked up from the photo album. I've never told your father that. Emma shrugged innocently. He says it's safer if he decides those things now. The room became very quiet. Emma had already turned the page, unaware that a single sentence had settled heavily inside her grandmother's heart. Safer if he decides. Not safer if we decide together. Safer if he decides. A few days later came Margaret's annual checkup with Dr. Collins. She had seen the same physician for nearly 15 years. The receptionist greeted her by name. So good to see you again, Margaret. For a moment, she felt like herself. Then David stepped beside her. I'll handle the paperwork. Before Margaret could answer a single question, every form had already been completed. Inside the examination room, Dr. Collins smiled warmly. Margaret, how have you been feeling? She opened her mouth. I've noticed she's repeating herself more often, David answered. Margaret turned toward him. I repeated one story. It happened a few times. Dr. Collins nodded while typing into the computer. And she's been a little less steady on her feet. Margaret looked from the doctor to her son. Neither man seemed to notice she had stopped speaking. The conversation continued around her. About her, without her. When the appointment ended, Dr. Collins printed the visit summary and handed it directly to David. Keep an eye on these recommendations. David folded the papers neatly. I will. Margaret reached out instinctively. I'd like to read that. David smiled without looking up. Of course. He slipped the papers into his folder. I'll go over everything with you when we get home. He spoke gently, lovingly, as though he were doing her a favor. Margaret slowly lowered her hand. Walking toward the parking lot, she realized something that unsettled her far more than losing a set of house keys. Somewhere along the way, people had stopped asking what she thought. They had started asking David instead. And for the first time in 76 years, Margaret wondered whether the next decision about her life would be made before she even knew a decision was being made. Margaret didn't sleep well after the doctor's appointment. It wasn't because of anything Dr. Collins had said. It was because of everything she hadn't been allowed to say. She lay awake listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway strike every hour, remembering a time when she had been the one making decisions for everyone else. When David caught the flu at 9, she had known exactly when to call the doctor. When Thomas lost his job during the recession, she had quietly stretched every dollar until they found solid ground again. For decades, people had trusted her judgment. Now, somehow, they seemed to trust everyone else's judgment about her. The next morning, Margaret stood in the kitchen, filling her weekly pill box. She had done it herself for years. 1 tablet after breakfast, 1 vitamin after lunch, half a blood pressure pill before bed. The routine was almost automatic. Just as she snapped the last compartment closed, David walked through the back door carrying 2 bags of groceries. His smile faded when he saw the pill organizer. Mom, he set the bags on the counter. I told you I'd take care of that every Sunday. Margaret looked at him calmly. I've already finished. David picked up the organizer and examined it. You put Tuesday night's pill in the wrong compartment. Margaret frowned. No, I didn't. He turned the box toward her. This one belongs here. She looked more closely. He was right. 1 tablet had been placed in the wrong section. Margaret moved it without arguing. There. It's not a big deal, David said gently. This is exactly why I wanted to help. Margaret rested both hands on the counter. I corrected it. I know, but what if you hadn't noticed? The question lingered in the room. For a moment, Margaret couldn't answer, not because she believed he was right, because she realized a single mistake had suddenly become proof that she shouldn't be trusted. That afternoon, Margaret decided to drive to the library. Books had always been her refuge. The librarian, Mrs. Green, greeted her with a warm smile. "Your mystery novels just came in." Margaret checked out 3 books and chatted for a few minutes before heading home. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed David's truck already parked outside. He was standing beside her car, arms folded. "I called twice. My phone was in my purse. I was worried. I was at the library. You could have told me." Margaret switched off the engine. "I didn't know I needed permission." David sighed. "It's not permission." "It feels like it." The words surprised both of them. For the first time since all of this had begun, Margaret had pushed back. David's expression softened. "I'm only trying to make sure you're okay." "I know." She stepped out of the car and closed the door quietly. But being okay isn't the same as being watched. David opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Instead, he picked up the library books. "I'll carry these." Margaret almost said no. Instead, she let him. Not because she couldn't carry them, because she was tired of turning every ordinary moment into a disagreement. On Thursday evening, Emma came over to finish her history project. The assignment was simple. Interview a family member about an important life decision. Emma spread her notebook across the dining room table. "Grandma, what's the biggest decision you ever made?" Margaret smiled. "There were many. But the biggest?" Margaret thought for a long moment. "Marrying your grandfather." Emma wrote it down. "What was the second biggest?" "Keeping this house after he died." "Weren't you scared?" "Very." "Then why didn't you sell it?" Margaret looked around the dining room. Every mark on the hardwood floor, every photograph, every crack in the old plaster ceiling held part of her family's history. "Because this house reminds me who I am." Emma nodded thoughtfully. Just then, David walked into the room. "What are you two talking about?" "My project." Emma smiled. "Grandma says keeping this house was one of the biggest decisions of her life." David laughed softly. "It probably won't be her decision forever." The words came so naturally that he didn't seem to hear them. Margaret did. Emma did too. The little girl looked from her father to her grandmother. "What do you mean?" David waved his hand casually. "Oh, nothing. We're just planning ahead." Planning. Again, Margaret noticed how often that word appeared whenever someone else made choices for her. No one called it deciding anymore. They called it planning, helping, preparing, protecting. Different words, the same result. That night, after everyone had gone home, Margaret stood alone in the living room. She rested her hand on the mantel where Thomas's photograph still stood. "I think I finally understand," she whispered into the quiet house. "This isn't about the keys anymore." Outside, the porch light cast a warm glow across the empty driveway. Inside, Margaret looked around the home she had built, one careful decision at a time. For the first time, she wasn't asking whether David loved her. She knew he did. The question keeping her awake now was far more frightening. If everyone already believed they should decide what was best for her, how long would it be before they stopped asking what she wanted altogether? The following Saturday began like dozens of Saturdays before it. Margaret tied on her gardening gloves, filled her old green watering can, and stepped into the backyard just after 8 o'clock. The roses needed trimming. The tomato vines had begun to sag under their own weight. Thomas always said a garden rewarded the people who paid attention. Margaret had never forgotten that. She was halfway through pruning a climbing rose when she heard David's truck pull into the driveway. He wasn't supposed to come until Sunday. She wiped the dirt from her hands and walked toward the side gate. "You're here early." I was in the neighborhood. He kissed her cheek before carrying 2 cardboard storage boxes into the garage. I thought I'd help organize a few things. Margaret followed him. I didn't know the garage needed organizing. It doesn't. He smiled. But it will make life easier later. Again. That word. Later. She watched as he opened an old cabinet and began sorting paint cans, tools, and holiday decorations into neat piles. These can probably go. He held up Thomas's rusty toolbox. Margaret reached for it immediately. No, it's falling apart. It still works. Mom, it stays. David hesitated before placing it back on the shelf. All right. He didn't argue, but Margaret noticed the expression on his face. Not frustration, pity, as though she were clinging to something she no longer understood. An hour later, Melissa arrived with coffee and pastries. The 3 of them worked quietly. Melissa folded blankets that had been stored in plastic bins. David labeled shelves with a marker. Margaret dusted old picture frames. For a while it almost felt pleasant, until Melissa held up a small cardboard box. Should we keep these? Inside were dozens of birthday cards Thomas had written over the years. Every anniversary, every Mother's Day, every Christmas. Margaret smiled softly. I'd like to keep them. Melissa nodded. Of course. She set the box aside. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she said, We'll need to decide what can fit wherever you end up. Margaret looked at her. Wherever I end up? Melissa froze. David looked up from the shelves. No one's saying anything is happening soon. But you are talking about it. It's only a conversation. A conversation I've never been part of. Silence settled over the garage. David removed his work gloves. We're just trying to be prepared. Margaret met his eyes. Prepared for what? Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, David spoke. For the future. Margaret nodded once. Then she quietly returned to dusting the picture frames. The conversation ended. The question did not. Monday morning brought rain. Margaret decided to stay inside and sort through old recipe cards. She had collected them for nearly 50 years. Some were stained with butter. Others still carried Thomas's handwritten notes in the margins. Needs more pepper. Emma loved this one. The familiar handwriting made her smile. As she slipped one recipe back into the box, a glossy brochure slid from between the cards. She frowned. She didn't remember putting it there. Across the front, in elegant blue lettering, were the words, Oak Grove Senior Living. Margaret stared at it. She opened the brochure slowly. Large photographs filled the pages, residents laughing over lunch, walking through flower gardens, playing cards, reading beside fireplaces. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked carefully designed to reassure families. A yellow sticky note clung to the inside cover. Melissa's handwriting. Ask about larger one-bedroom. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even known. A second folded sheet slipped onto the dining room table. It was an appointment confirmation. Private tour. Thursday, 2 p.m. Reserved for Margaret Ellis and family. Margaret read the words twice. Then a third time. She searched her memory. No one had mentioned Thursday. No one had asked whether she wanted a tour. No one had asked whether she wanted to move. Someone had simply reserved a place for her. The front door opened. David stepped inside carrying a bag of groceries. I thought I'd surprise you. Margaret didn't answer. She remained seated at the dining room table. The brochure lay open before her. David saw it instantly. His smile disappeared. I was going to tell you. When? He placed the groceries on the counter. After we had more information. You made an appointment. We only wanted to look. We? Melissa and I. Margaret nodded slowly. So everyone is planning my future. No, except me. David rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, please don't make this sound worse than it is. Worse than what? He hesitated. We're trying to avoid making decisions in a crisis. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. Do you believe I'm no longer capable of making decisions for myself? David answered too quickly. No, but his eyes drifted toward the brochure, toward the appointment, toward the plans already made. Margaret noticed. You didn't answer with your eyes. The words landed harder than either of them expected. David sat across from her. I don't think you're incapable. Then why does everyone keep deciding before asking? He searched for an answer that would make sense. He stopped. I don't want something bad to happen. Margaret nodded. I don't want that either. She closed the brochure carefully and rested both hands on top of it. But somewhere between protecting me and preparing for me, she paused. You stopped seeing me. Neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. The old grandfather clock counted another quiet minute. For the first time since Thomas had died, Margaret understood that the greatest threat to her independence wasn't illness. It wasn't age. It wasn't even time. It was the heartbreaking possibility that the people who loved her most no longer believed she should be the author of her own life. And as David quietly gathered the untouched groceries from the counter, Margaret realized something else. If she waited any longer, the next family decision might not simply be made without her. It might become impossible to undo. David drove home in silence. Melissa glanced toward him twice before finally turning off the radio. Neither of them had much to say. The brochure for Oak Grove still lay on the center console between them. For the first time since they had started talking about senior living, neither of them reached for it. When they arrived home, Emma was already waiting in the kitchen, finishing her homework. Did Grandma like the place? She asked. David loosened his tie. We didn't go. Emma looked surprised. Why not? David hesitated. Because Grandma didn't know we'd arranged it. Emma frowned. You didn't ask her first? No one answered. The little girl looked from her father to her mother. Then she said the words neither adult expected. If someone packed my room and picked my school without asking me, she shrugged, I'd think they didn't trust me anymore. Melissa slowly lowered her eyes. David stared at the kitchen counter. Children had a way of saying difficult truths without trying to. That night, he walked into the garage looking for a flashlight. Instead, he found an old cardboard box marked in his mother's handwriting. David, A-G-E. 8. Curious, he opened it. Inside were school drawings, report cards, a baseball glove, a faded permission slip from a 5th grade field trip. Across the bottom, Margaret had written in blue ink, his first decision without me. I almost said no. I'm glad I let him go. David read the sentence again. Then again, he remembered that trip. He had been frightened. Margaret had been frightened too. But she had trusted him enough to let him grow. He sat on the concrete floor for a long time, holding a piece of paper that had been folded for almost 30 years. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had carefully avoided. When had protecting his mother become more important than trusting her? On Sunday afternoon, David arrived at Margaret's house carrying nothing but a loaf of fresh bread. No brochures, no folders, no plans. Margaret welcomed everyone inside. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same lace tablecloth, the same candles, the same family photographs. Emma helped set the table. Melissa carried in the mashed potatoes. Margaret placed the roast in the center of the table. For a while, the conversation stayed light. Emma talked about school. Melissa laughed about burning a batch of cookies. David smiled when he could. But Margaret sensed the weight he carried. After dinner, she stood and disappeared into the hallway. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box. Emma smiled. Grandpa's memory box. Margaret nodded. She opened it carefully. Inside lay dozens of memories collected across almost 5 decades. Letters, photographs, Thomas's old wristwatch, and the tiny silver key that had once hung beside the house key. Margaret picked it up. "Your grandfather never remembered what this key opened." Emma giggled. "So why keep it? Thomas used to say, 'Not every key opens a door. Some remind you what you're responsible for.'" Margaret turned toward David. "When you were 7, you wanted to ride your bicycle without training wheels." David smiled faintly. "You kept running behind me." "I did." "And then you let go." "I did." "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" Margaret looked at him with gentle eyes. "Because if I had held on forever." She paused. "You would never have learned that you could ride on your own." Silence settled over the room. Margaret placed the photograph beside the tiny silver key. "I spent your childhood slowly giving you more choices." She folded her hands together. "The hardest part of growing older." She searched for the right words. "I has been watching those choices quietly disappear." Nobody interrupted. No one looked away. "I don't need you to become my father." Her voice remained calm. "I only need you to stay my son." David closed his eyes. The sentence struck deeper than any accusation could have. He suddenly saw every moment through different eyes. The keys, the bridge club, the doctor's appointment, the canceled plans, the brochure. He hadn't taken one big thing away. He had taken 100 small ones. And together, they had become her life. Emma reached across the table. "Dad," David looked at her. "When Dr. Collins asks Grandma a question next time," she tilted her head innocently, "will you let Grandma answer first?" David felt something inside him give way. Not because he had lost an argument, because he finally understood what he had been taking. Without saying a word, he reached into his coat pocket. The familiar ring of keys rested in his hand. He held them for several long seconds before placing them gently on the table. He didn't slide them toward Margaret. He simply let them rest between them. "I've been carrying these," he said quietly. "I thought they would make you safer." His voice trembled. "I didn't realize they were making you smaller." Margaret looked at the keys, then at her son. "I know why you did it." "I should have asked." "You should have listened." "I will." No promises about never making mistakes. No dramatic speeches. Only one honest sentence. "I want to learn how to help you without replacing you." Melissa quietly reached into her handbag. She removed the Oak Grove brochure. Without anyone asking, she folded it once, then again. Finally, she tore the appointment card in half and placed the pieces in the recycling bin beside the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I planned a future for you instead of asking what future you wanted." Margaret stood and embraced her. Not because the hurt had vanished, because understanding had finally arrived. 3 weeks later, Margaret returned to Dr. Collins for a follow-up visit. David drove her there. When the nurse called her name, both of them stood. Inside the examination room, Doctor Collins smiled warmly. "Margaret, how have you been feeling?" David instinctively drew a breath. Then he stopped himself. He turned toward his mother. "Mom." He smiled. I think he'd like to hear your answer. Margaret smiled back. I think so too. She answered every question herself. David listened, for perhaps the first time in months. That evening they returned to the old white house beneath the maple tree. Margaret stepped onto the porch. She reached into her coat pocket. The familiar brass key rested against her fingertips. She unlocked the front door herself. Before walking inside, she turned. David stood one step behind her, carrying 2 grocery bags. He waited. He didn't move toward the lock. He didn't reach for the handle. He simply asked, "Need a hand with the groceries, Mom?" Margaret smiled. "Yes." "With the groceries." She slipped the key back into her pocket. Not because it opened the front door, but because it reminded her of something far more important. Growing older had never meant giving away the right to choose. And real love was never measured by how many decisions someone made for you, but by how faithfully they honored the ones you could still make for yourself. Before we continue, if stories like this remind you that growing older should never mean giving up your voice, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more heartfelt family stories that celebrate dignity, respect, and the enduring bond between generations. And if this story speaks to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.